Hey, Ten. Thanks for coming in so early. Sorry about waking you up, but I just got an urgent message from the director of the Myrtle Beach Underground. Their scout team is telling them that the local locks are weakening at the Broadway at the beach storage zones. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. You've seen me wander in the loop over Zelda, but we can't pass up this opportunity. I'm going to take you up personally, and you can count on me. On another note, I don't think we have walked you through all the different Wi-Fi storage zones in the area, but Broadway is a pretty big one for APOC. It's a place with a lot of people that just lounge around. It's not unusual to see people with laptops out or talking on a cell phone. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but APOC has a lot of low-level historic cleaners that need access to the material from time to time, but they don't want the same people going in and out of the same buildings all the time. It look a little suspicious. It's not unusual for an official to need a piece of information while they're on vacation, and it's easier to stop by Broadway and get dinner than it is to go into the office. Anyways, our preliminary sampling suggests that they get a lot of Gilded Age and progressive material, turn of the century stuff on this location. When you're trying to convince people of why an oligarchy of the wealthy is a great thing, corrupting the message of the Gilded Age is pretty important. You'll see. It'd be great if we can slip in while their locks are weak, grab whatever we can get our hands on. Grab that bag over there. Gamma's got a little disguise for you set up. We're going to take 2 cars. I'm going to follow you. Red's going to drop you off at Broadway. We're going to keep you on a one-way radio so you don't accidentally trip on some jack doing some signal chasing. Oh, and Red has a new toy for you. She's going to drive you so you can get some work done on the way.
The Civil War marks a major turning point in the creation of a new national marketplace. Prior to the Civil War, railroads had been a major source of contention between the North and the South. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the southern states did not like to think that their money was being used towards internal improvements that would help just the North and the West. If you think about it, the South had those deep navigable rivers that they did not need to have railroads to access. The North wanted those railroads so that they could get the raw materials from the West to their factories in the East, and then their products created in those factories in the East out to the West. The other reason that it became a source of contention was because more railroads meant that more people were moving into the West. And every time a new state was created in the West, that meant that they would have to discuss this issue of slavery and whether it was going to be a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery state. It was a source of contention. So when the Civil War happened in 1860 and the South decided to leave the Union, ironically, that gave the North all the votes that they needed in order to pass a law to build this new transcontinental railroad across the country. This reflected a number of different things. It reflected the desire by Republicans to increase the strength of the national government. Later on, it's also going to play into their pro-business ideology. Once the decision was made to build the Transcontinental Railroad, the question then became how to do so. There are a number of ways that the federal government helped to subsidize the creation of the railroad. One of the major ways was known as land grants. Essentially what would happen, the government would grant a mile worth of land on either side of a potential railroad track and just give it away to the railroad companies for free. In fact, once the land grant system was in place, it's estimated that about the amount of land equivalent to the size of Texas was just given away to the railroad companies for free. Why was this done? There's a number of reasons why. If you give the railroad companies about a 2-mile pathway of land, that kind of sets the route that the train has to run through. So that way the government can control where the railroad starts and ends to some extent. The second reason is that that land was given away to the railroads so that the railroad companies could then go and sell the land, which would help pay for the tracks to go through the territory. The railroads could also set up little towns, which then they could charge rent, typically along the railroad lines at the railroad stops. The second thing that the government did to help promote the creation of these railroads actually has nothing to do with the railroads. It's called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is where the government would give away free land to settlers if they decided to live in that territory for some certain amount of time. I believe it's about 10 years. But the point is that the settlers would move out west, and then they'd be forced to use the railroads. Also, by having settlers out west, you're creating a new national marketplace. You're growing the West. More people are going to be farming that territory. They're going to be mining those minerals and getting them into the factories into the East. It links the countries together into what's known as a national marketplace. And lastly, by getting the railroads into the West, the farmers will now have access to the rail lines and access to ways to get their products back and forth across the country, helping, one, to create that new national marketplace, but also helping us tap into those rich, fertile farmlands of the Great Plains, which had no river access, which means there was no real way to get a large amount of products to the rest of the population out east. So this land subsidies, the Homestead Act, and then just creating this national marketplace were all ways that the government helped build this transcontinental railroad.
Zed just told me about the local locks weakening in Broadway. We've never seen this before, but we have some tools for you that may come in handy. First is, we have an IP scrambler that will clip onto your Wi-Fi device. If anyone checks your device, it will look like you're updating your Shufflehead blog again. Zed specifically requested either that or a Kevin Hart blog. Hope that means something to you because I think he was playing a joke on you. The second tool combines with the first. It is a cell phone that taps the local Wi-Fi. It has a built-in voice-activated recording device. Just whisper into the headphone mic and it records to text. Maybe it will look like you're singing Shufflehead's Remember song. I heard that on Direct Make It in the blog for you.
As the Transcontinental Railroad began to push into the West and other railroads followed, the railroad companies ran into the issue of the buffalo. Now, the buffalo are huge stampeding animals. Sometimes the stampedes would be miles long, described in the sources. And they were a physical threat to the track. They would actually destroy railroad tracks and the ties, and if they ran into the cars, they'd destroy those. So the railroad companies wanted to eliminate the buffalo because of the physical threat to the railroad tracks. Also, the Plains Indians were dependent on the buffalo as a source of food and clothing and shelter. So to eliminate the buffalo would also mean to eliminate that food source and way of life from the Plains Indians, which means the Indians would either have to leave or starve. So to eliminate the buffalo was encouraged by the railroad companies. Again, to do so is going to protect the tracks and get rid of the Native Americans that were going to threaten the settlement of the white settlers. As the railroads moved into the West and as they started to eliminate the buffalo and as they were trying to get more white settlers to move into the West, it's important to remember that the white settlers were moving there in order to take advantage of the Homestead Act, the new marketplaces created by the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a long tradition that goes back in American history, going all the way back to Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. If you remember, that was when Andrew Jackson took 5 or so different tribes and tried to push them east across the Mississippi into Oklahoma. So this a very similar goal is happening here in the 1880s and the 1890s, and that is to push Native Americans from their traditional tribal lands onto reservations. And even then that wasn't good enough, because as new mineral resources were found to be present, or as more white settlers wanted to get into the territory, the Native Americans were pushed onto smaller and smaller reservations. Now, it's important to remember as well that when we talk about the Plains Indians, we need to remember that there was no single Plains Indian designation. There's many different tribes that we use that generic term for. So what often would happen was the government would make a treaty with one tribe and then apply it generally to all different tribes. And it didn't really work that way, which led to a series of what are known as Indian Wars and other conflicts that we'll talk about in a minute. Oftentimes, even with these treaties and reservation systems, the Native Americans are going to be taken advantage of by corrupt government officials who would pocket the money that was supposed to be used to relocate the Native Americans and basically let them fend for themselves, even though legally they were not supposed to do so. They're supposed to be providing help and assistance. So all in all, this policy is not good, and it's going to give way to something that's arguably not much better.
This last part is the coolest. The phone has a local lock sensor. We don't know exactly where the storage zones are, so the phone will buzz when you encounter one. It will take our program about 3 minutes between the time it recognizes the weakened Wi-Fi lock and when it finds and buffers the relevant recordings. Walk past the location and then come back to it a few minutes later. think this was one of Gamma's suggestions anyway, so you can spot any of the guards. So good luck out there, and come back safely, please.
Today we're going to talk about the Native American reactions to westward expansion. Many Native Americans did acquiesce or go along with the treaty negotiations and the move to the reservations, assuming that it couldn't get much worse. There was a heavy amount of resistance, though. Native Americans that chose to resist against the white settlers coming into their territories would often fight back. This occurred in a series of conflicts known as the Indian Wars. This isn't one specific battle with one specific tribe, but we can see that those soldiers who had been fighting the Civil War and then had been in the South during Reconstruction, and then those American soldiers just shifted into the West. And they're going to be fighting Native Americans, and typically what happens is the U.S. cavalry would fight Native Americans. The Native Americans would be pushed onto further and further smaller territories in their reservations. Eventually, this policy gives way to the Dawes Act. The Native American policy of Indian removal and the Indian Wars drew many criticisms, which led to the Dawes Severalty Act. You see here the word severalty. They're trying to sever something, and they're trying to sever the Native American culture from the Native American person. This is often referred to as assimilation. They're trying to make the Native culture similar to the dominant white culture. At the time, they would have referred to this as killing the Indian to save the man. What they would do, what the Dawes Act did, was take all the reservation territory and chop it up into 160-acre plots. The Native American head of household, or usually typically father, was given that 160 acres of land. They were expected to farm it for 25 years, and after that point, if they did so successfully, they would be able to keep the land in perpetuity. The problem is that two things. First, this was partially a trick to break the land up so that white settlers could get the majority of the reservation. Even if you gave every head of household 160 acres, that's only a fraction of the territory of the reservation. The rest of the territory went to the white settlers. The other problem with this is it violates the traditional patterns of life for the Native Americans. They didn't know how to farm. They didn't know how to live that settled white lifestyle, especially in the plains where they were typically hunters of the buffalo. So a lot of farms failed, which meant that the land reverted back to the white population as well. Another nefarious thing that happened was that the government decided to help instruct Native American children to be white, into the white culture. The Native American children were often taken from their families, sent to white boarding schools where they were taught how to speak English, how to dress and act in a white traditional way. What happens in the end, not only does it cause a lot of anger and frustration within the Native American community, but those children lose their traditional Native American cultural ways. And at the end of this process, Native Americans are left not only poor because they don't have any reservation land and nor farmland, but they're also left culturally destitute, with a generation losing the traditional ways of the Native American populations.
Hey, so Red gave you the rundown. I'll be your lookout. I'll stay a few stores behind you. I'm keeping you on one-way radio in case there's some people signal chasing. I want you to focus on the mission. I do need to know where you're going to be collecting, though. Look in the glove box. There's a chalk device for your shoe. It sticks on the toe, and just a quick drag is going to mark your location. As Red explained, you need to walk past and come back anyways. This is going to give me a chance to set up an observation zone in case there's any patrols making rounds.
Perhaps no incident captures the post-Civil War mood towards Native Americans better than the massacre at Wounded Knee. The Native Americans had been attempting to recapture some of their cultural heritage after the Dawes Act had tried to strip so much of that away through assimilation. One of the efforts is known as the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a traditional dance that would have honored ancestors. Some people in the Native American community actually saw this almost as messianic, that there would be a leader that would emerge that would help Native Americans defeat the encroachment of the white settlers. The military would have been aware of this notion of the ghost dance, that it was sort of a initiator of battle. The the military was in the Plains territories because of the Indian Wars. They would have been keeping track of the Native Americans as they gathered to perform these ceremonies. Probably the biggest gathering at the time was going to take place at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. It was a little spontaneous, and there's a bit more to it than this, but the gathering happens in Wounded Knee. The cavalry is surrounding the Native Americans for a number of different reasons that we don't need to get into. The Native Americans begin to perform the ceremony. There was a shot that was fired. We're not really sure where from, but we do know that men, women, and children are going to be slaughtered as the cavalry open fire, partially because of this fear that this would lead to a large Native American uprising. Men, women, and children are killed. Eventually, they're just going to be buried in a mass grave. It's called the Massacre of Wounded Knee now. At one point, it was called the Battle at Wounded Knee, although it really wasn't a battle. The Native Americans had been disarmed earlier in the day, for the most part, in tent-to-tent searches by the cavalry. At the end of this process at Wounded Knee, the Native Americans have been foiled again at their attempt to recapture their culture. They are left with no voice in the American democracy because they're not really considered citizens. They are poor and destitute and really...
Gem wants me to let you know that he has been in touch with his contacts at the Broadway location, and it looks clear. Normal patrols and such, but those are easy enough to get around. I know you've talked with him since we got back from the Marina Inn's mission about how I'm doing. I'm glad you're concerned, but I'm fine. I'm glad Zelda's alive, and soon I'll figure out a way to bring her back home and fix whatever it is they did to her. But right now, you're my priority. I'll keep you safe. That woman wasn't really my sister anyways, was she?
In a capitalist country, you often hear the term referred to as laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire typically means hands-off. In extreme capitalist ideology, the government should have no role in promoting the economy. It should leave all the decisions up to the owners of the factories and the consumers themselves. The invisible hand of the marketplace will take care of everything else. However, that does not always happen. In fact, even in a laissez-faire system, the government always has some sort of a role to play within the economy. In the turn of the century, 1900s and on, American economy, the government was very active in promoting entrepreneurship. And there are a number of things that we're going to learn about that the government did in order to promote the economy, even when we're in this period of laissez-faire economics. The government definitely was not hands-off. And there are several misconceptions that we need to avoid. First of all, there's a misconception that the government can only impede or block economic growth, and that's just not true. There's no evidence to support that. Also, there's a myth that the American individual is more important than anything else. And again, this is a misconception because we're going to see these massive corporations and we're going to see massive investment by the government. And the American individual is incredibly important, and the small business owner is incredibly important. But for the American economic power that emerges in the turn of the century, it's just not enough to say that the American individual was responsible for all of that. The government's involvement in this quote-unquote laissez-faire capitalist economy goes all the way back to the founding fathers and Alexander Hamilton. Remember, Hamilton desired the creation of an industrialized economy that would promote these complex financial systems. He also wanted to increase trade with the British. But most importantly for our purposes here, he was instrumental in the creation of a national bank. And the National Bank was important early on because it helped to get capital or money to private businesses. So again, the government is helping to finance this entrepreneurship model of the government. Also, Hamilton was very important because of the national tariff. National tariffs don't go along with this idea of laissez-faire economics because it prevents competition with foreign countries and foreign businesses. So he's actually, the tariff would protect American, what they called infant industries, in these factories and businesses that are just getting started, from foreign competition. So it's not exactly hands-off, it's actually very protectionistic. So the founding fathers, going all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, were very influential, even in this time of laissez-faire capitalism.
Our best strategy, I think, is to start over by the aquarium. Starbucks seems like a logical place for a storage zone. Lots of people lounging around, free Wi-Fi. But we go there quite often, and no one I know of has ever been picked up there. In fact, we had a whole conversation there before the Marina Inn mission, and we weren't picked up. We also don't want you to stay in one spot. Someone might get suspicious. There's a lot of storage zones around Broadway, so get a few segments and get on to the next one. Looks like you guys just pulled in. Red is heading back to the bunker. I'll pick up when it's time to leave.
As the government expanded into the West, we can also see that this has a positive impact during this age of laissez-faire capitalism. The government basically sponsored the entire westward expansion, which is going to benefit the private businesses tremendously. The government did so through purchasing land, like the $10 million that Thomas Jefferson used to buy Louisiana Territory, through negotiating treaties like the one in Oregon with the British, and sometimes outright war, like with the Mexican Cession Territory. All of this takes vast amounts of capital and funding, even if it's not directly payments to other countries. The government was also incredibly influential with the removal of Native Americans, again by treaty or by force, like with the Indian Wars. They were also very influential by giving money directly to railroad companies in the form of either land grants or subsidies. Again, but the expansion of the railroads into the West allowed more settlers to move into the West, and the government was basically giving this land away for free. It was free to the railroads. They also gave land directly to settlers with a Homestead Act. This land is land that could have been sold to people. Instead, it was given away for free, so the government actually lost money on this. All of this expansion into the West creates both new markets for private businesses, more people that they can sell to. It also allows those raw materials to come back to the factories in the East so that the companies benefit again that way as well. So new markets and new materials, both paid for largely by the federal government. During this time of laissez-faire capitalism, the government was actively involved in protecting the entrepreneur and the inventors. This is done through passing laws that would help to create an environment that would help them to flourish. For example, in the Supreme Court case, Dartmouth versus Woodward, the Supreme Court upheld the idea of the sanctity of a contract. This means that once a contract is made, it cannot be broken. So if I offer to pay $100 for a series of books, and the books are created, I have to give that money, otherwise I will be breaking the contract and I can be sued. This provides the business some level of security, especially when you consider that even the federal government cannot break a contract. That's how sacred the contracts become. Another way is by creating patent laws. The idea that if you get your invention patented, then the inventor will be able to earn money on that idea. This creates an incentive for inventors to come up with new fabulous ideas, and they can make a living off of the ideas, not just the creation of the product. Also, the interstate commerce or trade between the states is now able to be regulated. Again, this can be seen in the Supreme Court case Gibbon versus Ogden. This is important because, again, it gives business some levels of security. You know that if you sign a contract and if there's a dispute, there's somebody there that can regulate the conflict. And lastly, another law that is put in place, going all the way back to the founders, is the idea of a tariff. This idea that the government will protect American businesses from the competition of the foreign businesses. So the government is involved in a number of different ways legally in order to help protect, even during this time of laissez-faire economics.
Hey, just saw the first mark outside of Ben & Jerry's. If you want to go get a scoop, my favorite's mint choco chunk. The mint's going to be soothing to your stomach too. Might just help calm your nerves if you're feeling a little bit stressed. There's a little bit of spending money in that bag Gamma gave you. Didn't want to look too suspicious just wandering around. Remember, get a segment or two in and move on.
There are a number of different ways that the government does encourage technological advancements. And we can see that during this time period, one of the large technological advancements of the era was the invention of the steam engine. Now, the government didn't have anything directly involved with that, but the government did help to foster the environment that led to this development, and it did invest in the transportation that comes out of it. The government was heavily invested in the railroad, which would require the steam engine, and also the development of the steamboat. Steamboats were important because now, in addition to being able to get your product down the Mississippi River, that steamboat can actually go upstream as well. So you get two-way traffic on the Mississippi, and again, opening up the national marketplace. That's incredibly important for this particular indicator. The last is that the steam engine is also involved in oil drilling, which is going to become incredibly important, not because of cars, which most people would think, but because oil is vitally necessary for the industrial era, both in terms of lubrication and also because of things like kerosene, which come out of the time period. So again, new technological changes are very important to this era of laissez-faire capitalism. And again, the government does get involved with promoting the transportation and such that comes out of that. One of the biggest things that the government did do to support business during this era is to be anti-labor union or anti-worker. This is accomplished in several different ways. The first was through fostering an open immigration policy. In this era, immigrants tended to come over. They were poor, they tended to be uneducated, they tended to have very few skills. This means that they fed into the cheap labor supply, which was needed in this industrialized world. They tended to be very, like I said, unskilled, and they tended to work cheaply, and the factory owners would use immigrants rather than pay the white working class worker a higher wage. If you increase the supply of labor, you're going to keep the wages low. So increase supply, demand stays the same, wages go down. The only exception to this, of course, was the Chinese due to racism. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in the 1880s in order to keep the Chinese out. Another way that the government helped to promote anti-labor policy was through the actual physical violence against labor unions. If a labor union during the 1880s and 90s, even into the 1900s, went on strike, typically the government would side with the management and oftentimes would actually send the military to break up strikes. Imagine that. The American military used against American workers. They would jail the strikers. Sometimes they would even open fire on them, killing some. Lastly, the government did have tariffs. However, remember that the tariffs did not support the workers. They were there to support the business, and while the workers' jobs were protected, the tariff artificially inflates prices, so they did not actually benefit as consumers because the prices were higher than they should have been if the market, invisible hand of the market was actually in place.
Hey, Ten, it looks like there's a cluster of people coming towards you in the ice cream shop. It might be nothing, but it might be a few jacks on patrol. The cell phone is at least the next segment buffered anyways, so wander out of the shop and head towards the aquarium. There's some benches near the statue of the Rays outside the ticket booth. Head there, finish up before you go looking for the next local lock. I'll let you know if you need to run or if the coast is clear.
One of the last ways that the American government was promoting the economy even during this time of laissez-faire capitalism was through the policy of imperialism that begins in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Industrial growth in the United States meant that there was a surplus of products. Factories were just churning out stuff. And the American consumer couldn't buy all of it. So we had to find new markets. Well, this means that we had to go into foreign territories and try to sell our stuff there. The problem is not all of the foreign countries wanted our stuff, or they didn't have the economy that would support purchasing our items. So the American government went on fostered a policy of imperialism so that we could expand into new markets like China and sell our products there, get the raw materials as well from those territories. So we get new markets and new materials, again, sponsored by the government, paid for by the government. American militaries used to get into these territories. American diplomats are used to negotiate the treaties and terms of these different situations. So the United States was protecting American investments abroad, promoting international trade, taking over some territories in order to promote the American economy. Again, not exactly a hands-off situation, even in this time of laissez-faire capitalism.
So, from what I can gather from their conversation, that was just a church group on vacation from the upstate. Nothing really to worry about. Hey, speaking about church groups, did I ever tell you about that time I went to Ripley's as part of a youth group overnighter? We were going to sleep in the shark tunnel, and, well, the weird thing about that is...
Hello, Collector. You've been stealing from us. I cannot let you take our information for free. You are going to have to earn the rest. How about we play a little game?
Coming up next on the History Underground.
That's his style, you know. Always a risk taker, willing to risk his people. Tick-tock, collector. Time is up and you should really move on.
There you go again, Ten. Can't really see you in there, so I hope you're okay.
Pass by the oversells, you see their heads hung low. They are the next executioner, and this block on his death row. You walk slowly down the corridors, someone has prayed for your soul. And you can hear the silence behind you, because you are reaching a final goal.